Hi, thank you so much for agreeing to the interview today.
Yeah, sure. Nice to meet you, Hannah.
Yeah, how are you doing?
Good. How are you?
Good. So how do you approach, interpreting the music that from like composers that you collaborate with?
Well, um, I think with more contemporary pieces, um, on the one hand, it's not so different,
Mhm,
from when you're first learning a piece by an older composer that's new to you, but is more known to the world in general.
mhm,
Um, you're you're still kind of just learning notes and getting the sense of the piece as a whole. As you get to know more and more of it, it starts to kind of take shape in your mind. Um,
mhm,
and you may also listen to the composer's other music to get a sense of, uh, yeah, what they were doing on the
mhm,
whole and what their sound world is and their kind of emotional kind of landscape. And I
mhm,
mean, you would do that for many composers too. So in some ways, it's a very similar kind of process. The thing about newer music in our day and age is that um, there's so many possibilities and so many styles, so many kinds of sounds, and so many ways of like using all the elements of music, the harmony and the instruments,
mhm,
and the use of melody. Is it using the kind of melodies that you would kind of be able to hum back, or is that really not such an element of this music? Um, so um, that makes the process of figuring out what a piece is a little more involved
mhm,
and intense, can be more intensive in terms of making an effort to understand um, where the composer is coming from.
mhm.
And that can be literally like, oh, where are they coming from?
Yeah.
Um, and a bit of their life story, or at least as an artist, where they're emerging from, what are their influences or the things they're responding to.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, and yeah, getting a sense of them. And of course, the great thing about living composers is sometimes you can actually, as people, get to know them. And it
Yeah.
also starts to give you some insight into, um, yeah, what they were really imagining with their music.
Mhm,
And that gets into the whole thing of notation and scores. And some composers put a lot into the score, so you have a lot of information, and some do less. And um, sometimes that means you need to figure out whether it's just by getting to know them, reaching out to them, or by some other sort of research or something. But
mhm,
um, so yeah, so that you get a sense that, oh, they're going after this kind of sound and this kind of world,
mhm.
to lay that kind of basis. And then on top of that, you bring your own self to it.
Um, so like along with their new music, do you find that sometimes they ask for things that you've never really done before for like like romantic music or baroque
Uh-huh.
or technique?
Um,
Yeah,
in the playing of the instrument, you mean? Like,
yeah.
yeah, for sure. Um, some composers are very interested in that
Mm.
exploration. Some are less so. Some are like, oh yeah, you play the violin, so we'll use all these kinds
Alright.
of things we're all familiar with, and they're happy with that, and to just use that. Some composers are definitely keen on experimenting or pushing some kinds of limits of what um, instruments can do,
Mm.
or just even kind of subverting what you might expect from an instrument, doing surprising things with an instrument. So yeah, it comes up quite often. Um, by now um, there is almost a kind of alternative language of they call extended techniques.
Oh
Uh,
yeah.
yeah, which you may have know of for violin, but for all instruments. So those have in turn become um, somewhat codified in terms of uh, players' familiarity with them. Like, oh, this is a bow pressure noise, or it's
Mm.
we all know our ponticello and tasto and this kind of thing.
Mm.
But are there some other things, um, the effects and so on, and then also notation. So, but people are always finding more.
Yeah.
So,
I guess this one has to do more with the first question about like how do you, if you like disagree sometimes with like the modern composer, what they want from the music, and how to sort of navigate that with them.
um, well, I think that comes down to just a sort of human uh, relationship kind of thing, because every composer is a different person.
Mm.
Um, so if you really you're feeling strongly, whether it's an interpretive thing, like you really feel the music needs to do something, uh,
Hmm.
I think that's really just something yeah, to just state and discuss and hope that they're flexible.
Yeah.
Um, if the issue is more something like, oh, like speaking of extended techniques we were just talking about, if
Yeah.
they're like, oh, I want you to like hit your violin or or something, and you're like, no, I'm not okay with that.
Oh, okay.
Um, I mean, that's something just to be very clear and firm about. And or do you need to get like a spare instrument for this?
Oh.
Things like
Yeah.
that. There's some practical things, but you should always not hesitate um, to mention those kinds of things.
Mm.
If it's interpretive, I think it's yeah, it's like any negotiation. Like
Right.
if you're taking a trip with some people and some people
Yeah.
want to do this and you want to do that, and you just need to figure
Yeah.
it out.
Hmm. How does like collaborating with the composers like influence your understanding of their composition? Of course, it helps you understand it better, but I guess more like relationship wise, not with them.
Um, well, I find that sometimes just getting to know someone as a person, you start to um, get a feeling for why they even wanted to write music, or um, what are those experiences um, that motivate them uh, to activate their imagination and try to express it
Mm.
that way.
Yeah.
Um, it's yeah, it's a little bit hard to actually really quite explain, but because it's in terms of creativity, like if you're a player and an interpreter, it's a matter of getting into the emotional world of the
Mm.
piece.
Mhm.
So of course, talking to a composer, you can start to understand some specific things, like, oh, how they were thinking of the form of the piece, for instance. And maybe that wasn't so evident to you right away when you were learning it, but you're like, oh yeah, I see that you were thinking this kind of
Hmm.
progression of sections, or this thing is actually referring to that thing in the piece here, like, oh, that's really cool. And
Hmm.
you can get some information like that, but also just yeah, a bit, just the kind of personal sense of of yeah, their motivations. And also I find that another thing that's interesting is in terms of how people write down their music.
Yeah.
um you know, you can see a like a piano forte and some dynamics. They're the same symbols in gazillion pieces,
Mm-hmm.
but different people use those in different ways, you know. And some composers, um, I mean, you can take like uh, someone more like Beethoven,
Hmm.
who was, of course, we can still dispute certain things in his manuscripts and so on, but still, basically, his dynamics are super, super intentional, right?
Yes.
And it's like, yes, that piano is on that note, and it's very, very uh, embedded in the meaning of the music. But there are composers that you can see that they were really much more kind of loose and almost a little well, kind of more approximate, you know. They're like,
Yeah.
yeah, some softer here, and then you can crescendo here, and you can kind of tell that, well, the crescendo doesn't have to start right there. It could be here, and it's a much more kind of loose kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And some of those things you can feel like with older composers who are not around anymore, but sometimes also with people now, also just knowing them, you kind of get a feel for how they work
I
and
see.
or how their music works. It's
Mhm.
yeah.
Is there one that you prefer?
Oh, um, not really. I find both really interesting, you know. Um, composers who are very specific and thought out are the ones who are just very open to what happens in the moment.
Mm, yeah. Um, and I feel like, including myself, a lot of students don't really know how to start getting like introduced to modern classical music, and I feel like there's like sort of like a misconception of it that it's like sort of like modern art, if you know what I mean. Um, how do you think students can like better break through that barrier?
Um, yeah. Um, you mean for their own kind of
Yeah.
understanding of the music and
Yes.
yeah. Well, I think um, first of all, I think it's important, like I was saying, to realize that there's so many kinds of
Mhm.
modern music now. So
Yeah.
not to feel like it's just this type of thing. Um, so just know there's many, many composers and kinds of new music. And if you, I mean, there's a lot to explore, you know.
Mm.
Um, but I mean, what you said about modern art, it's true. Um, I think especially music that's less rooted in the tonal system
Mhm.
um, uh, is a little initially harder for some people to grasp, right? And to
Mhm.
feel like they know what's going on, whether that's listeners or musicians themselves.
Mhm.
And I do think that is a lot like going from um, yeah, like representational painting that
Yeah.
see people and buildings and a landscape, and then suddenly it's abstract, right? And we're
Yeah.
looking at shapes and colors.
Uh-huh.
Um, it is similar in that way.
Mhm.
And I think the key to that is then a lot of it becomes less about you're responding to these recognizable things and more, it's more about what is conjuring inside of you, right?
Mm.
the viewer or the listener. So it's a kind of just a shift of how you're experiencing
Yeah.
the music or the art.
Mm.
And I would say also with yeah, it's also a kind of a language, like learning
Mm.
another language. And that always takes patience, right? And
Mhm.
that's one thing. I mean, the tonal harmony is such a strong system that we get it
Yeah.
immediately, and um, that's why it's so powerful and it's so popular.
Mhm.
Um, and there's totally nothing wrong with that.
Yeah.
Um, but with this, some other kinds of music, um, yeah, it takes a little more of that investment of time with it
Yeah.
and repeated listening. That's just something that you have to decide you want to do.
Mhm.
And even if there's a little kernel of interest, like, well, I want to spend more time, and it starts to um, cohere into some more meanings.
Mm. Yeah.
Um, yeah, and it's sometimes can actually be a bit related um, to more uh, tonal listening. Like there's little elements of it that actually you latch onto,
Mm.
uh,
Yeah.
and some of it's just you start to uh, hear things a bit differently.
Would
And
you say that like each like a different modern composer is like learning a completely different language? Like sometimes I would find that like going between romantic composers, it's like quite easy to sort of see what their intent is with both of them. But how about it? How what is it like for modern?
yeah, that's a great question. I think there are definitely modern composers who are related in that way.
Yeah.
Um, for sure. You can hear them in similar ways. And
Mhm.
then it's very interesting in that way too, how
Yeah.
they start
Yeah.
to kind of group, and some of them are like literal connections, they were colleagues or teacher student or whatever, but sometimes it's not, they were just kind of in a similar area.
Mhm.
Um, and sometimes you do come across a composer who's really very individual and
Mm.
kind
Yeah.
of has their own thing um, going on. But I think the more you listen and the more you play, you start to grasp things more easily
Yeah.
rather than feeling totally at sea.
That's good.
Yeah.
Like talking about like modern composers, how do you feel about like AI being incorporated into like new compositions?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I'm not very expert about AI, but I've been, hearing a lot about it lately.
Mhm.
Um, I mean, I would have to say, I mean, my initial reaction to it is to be quite wary of it, just because the idea that a machine, no matter how sophisticatedly programmed it is,
Mhm.
um, the idea that it can sort of replicate and supplant what an individual human can do, and
Yeah.
I'm skeptical of. I mean, am also quite awestruck by what
Mhm.
uh, AI does seem able to do. Um, some things I've heard and seen are very impressive, but they always seem to have a kind of a sheen of yeah, something artificial there.
Yeah, I see.
But I mean, I would say, I mean, as with all a lot of technology in the last couple of decades. I'm not totally opposed to it. I feel like it's um, if they can be used as a tool and an element within a human created uh, product. I mean, not product, like creation.
Yeah.
Pro- product sounds too, but yeah, like creation, you know.
Uh-huh.
Um, I think it can still have an interesting place. I mean, I'm thinking also of, I mean, just with computer programs, it's not AI, but
Yeah.
um, I know of people who have used computer programs to generate musical material because they
Mm.
were setting certain um, parameters in terms of like pitches and rhythms. Like they would take
Oh,
a little German of an idea and then they put it through the program. So it would create all these permutations of this one
interesting.
idea.
Yeah.
Yeah. And before they had that program, they would have done a lot of this themselves,
Mm.
all the computation and that's very laborious. So being able
Yeah.
to have the computer spit out this stuff and then this composer could take all that and actually write their piece. And they're
Mm.
still writing their piece, but they used all this stuff
Yeah.
that came from the computer. And that to me makes a lot of sense.
Yeah,
Uh,
that does.
yeah, and it saved them a lot of time that they would have just spent on this. And then they can just go off and be creative with this material. So if there's some way also that AI could be used like that, where people are still in charge, you know, and and still making choices of how they incorporate it into their own vision.
Mm.
I think that that could be a very cool thing.
Yeah. Um, what what do you think the greatest like struggle is for like contemporary composers or like musicians?
Struggle. Well, I mean, it's a tough field in general. I mean, even classical music, right?
Yeah.
And new music within classical music, it's like a bit of a niche within a niche. But um, I think it's yeah, getting opportunities for the music to be heard
Mm.
and be played repeatedly and to be um, absorbed into somebody's repertoire.
Mhm.
Um, and it's hard for composers. I mean, it's a bit with performers too, but you know, if, unless you are um, have had a certain kind of success, so that people know you as like a handful of names.
Yeah.
Um, it's otherwise you there's just a big kind of yeah, massive
Mm.
composers there who are trying to do their thing, and it's hard to be sort of plucked out of that or differentiated from others, so that um, people are really trying to get to know uh, yeah, your own music and uh, making that investment of working on it and presenting it and putting the resources into putting
Mhm.
it on. So it takes a lot of kind of steps and um, people in the process,
Mhm.
going from like organizing the concert to musicians working on it and
Mhm.
all this to make these things happen. Um, so yeah, that's hard. Um, But I think the result is always so satisfying.
Yeah.
Also, it makes it all worthwhile. Yeah.
Do you think that maybe like in music education, something could be changed so that it'd be easier for like new composers to be known? Or do you think that like Mozart, Beethoven, all the like it's like essential to learn before going into these more modern compositions?
Well, I think both old and new are very important
Mhm.
to know. Um, I I do think it would be great to have the newer music introduced early on,
Mhm.
not just leave it to yeah, in high school if people have started when they were little, or even college or
Uh-huh.
old, have it really from from the beginning or close to the beginning, that yeah, kids are aware that this music's being written
Yeah.
now. I think part of it's just a kind of an attitude thing, right? It's just like
Mhm.
think, oh, I'm learning music, but this music is actually from
Yeah.
100 years ago. So yeah, kind of making that connection so that people feel the links from the old to the present in a really real kind of daily kind of way.
Mhm.
Um, that can make a lot of difference. And yeah, even if young people can meet some composers,
Yeah.
um, just to make it personal.
Mhm.
Yeah.
So when did you start getting into like modern classical music?
Well, it's interesting for me. I mean, when I had to play a more modern piece, say for an audition or um, jury exam or whatever in school, they're like play one piece written after
Yeah.
whatever, right? So even from a young age, when I had to do that, I have to say, I always really enjoyed it and was kind of curious, but I didn't think too much about it um, until I was in college, really. It's funny in my case, also, actually, my father is a composer.
Mm. Mm.
Um,
Wow.
yeah, both my parents are pianists, but my father is a composer. So I actually did grow up from beginning of my life with this awareness that music can be written now because I had a composer in the house.
Yeah.
And so that may have been part of also why I was not, I was never like put off by having to learn a new piece or something.
Mhm.
Um, but um, but on the other hand, I guess my dad never wanted to impose anything on me, so he so he didn't write me a piece for until I was much older. Um, and yeah, I don't know. I was very immersed in all the older repertoire for um, yeah, like my pre-college years and so on. But then once we got into college, I started to really um, actually pursue it.
Mhm.
I found I was really curious about these pieces and enjoying it. So I started to take every class that was offered and every ensemble, new music ensemble I could be in, and new music festival, just all those things. I started to kind of make my path um, toward those things.
Mhm. Just before we end, I want to ask you like one more question about if there are any like trends or like programs that would make it easier to find modern music.
Um, well, I mean, I think um, in terms of finding pieces, um, I mean, there are quite a few organizations now, and even like the orchestras that are around, or who are all trying to do more, or also have kind of supplemental programs
Mhm.
um, where they feature more newer works, and those are always great to check out,
Mhm.
um, to really take note of those things. Um, if you're looking as a player for newer pieces, um, I would start, besides just noting what's going on in the concerts and this kind of thing. But publishers, um, they're music publishers like Boozy and Shot and Peters and all these
Mm.
ones. You can probably, so your library or something can help you look up more of them if you need um, more of a list of them. But a lot of these publishers have taken on quite a roster of contemporary composers, and they are making an effort to put their music out there, and they will have some famous names you might have heard of, and then some that you really haven't, but are very worthwhile checking out.
Mm.
Um, so those can be a good resource. Also, some of them on their online catalogs they will have by instrumentation. So if you're looking for like the piano trio or
Mm.
whatever, it can be a good resource.
Mhm.
Um, there are also some new music organizations that have catalogs like that.
Mm.
Um, I think New Music USA still has one, which is for American composers. Or there's do you know about IRCAM in Paris?
Oh, no, I haven't heard of that.
Yeah, it's IRCAM. That's the acronym, but it's was started by the Ensemble de Contemporain in Paris.
Oh, I see.
Um, yeah, and they have a catalog, um, which has a lot of European composers, but not only. There are some also Americans and others. Quite extensive. So there are those, also some new music ensembles. If you start researching, they will have some repertoire lists.
Yeah.
So um, it is a kind of a research process. It can
Mm.
be.
Yeah.
I mean, I know some musicians, they're always just word of mouth, just asking their friends what they're what they're playing and what they're working on. But I think it's also sometimes you can just find interesting things
Mhm.
yourself. Yeah,
All right. Well, thank you so much for the interview, and I hope you have a good rest of your year. I'll keep in touch with you.
that's great.
Yeah.
Thanks a lot, Hannah.
Thank
Nice to
you. Nice
nice to
meeting
talk.
you.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.